What if the quiet waitress who served your coffee every morning wasn't just another struggling college student? What if the woman behind the restaurant counter, dismissed by everyone as timid and unremarkable, possessed skills that could neutralize a threat faster than most people could dial 911? This is the story of Jessica Morgan, the unassuming server at Murphy's Diner who became a local legend in 20 seconds. The time it took for an armed robber to discover that some people are far more dangerous than they appear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Diner cast their familiar harsh glow over red vinyl booths and checkered linoleum floors as Jessica Morgan tied her apron strings for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 28, she possessed an understated presence that made her nearly invisible in the bustling restaurant, exactly how she preferred it. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, her uniform was consistently clean but never flashy, and her interactions with customers were polite but brief. To everyone at Murphy's Diner, Jessica was simply the quiet waitress, who worked the morning shift, saved her tips religiously, and never caused drama. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of Oak Street and 3rd Avenue in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a blue-collar town where the biggest excitement usually came from high school football games and the annual Harvest Festival. The restaurant had been serving truckers, factory workers, and families for over 40 years, its yellowed walls decorated with faded photographs of local sports teams and handwritten signs advertising daily specials. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Jessica's co-workers had formed their opinions about her quickly and never bothered to revise them. To Rita Martinez, the veteran waitress who'd been working the dinner shift for 15 years, Jessica was a nice enough girl, but clearly lacking the backbone necessary for dealing with difficult customers. Rita's assessment was shared by most of the staff. Jessica was too soft, too quiet, too eager to avoid confrontation. "She's got no fire in her," Rita would often comment to the other servers during their smoke breaks behind the diner. "Sweet girl, but this job's gonna eat her alive if she doesn't toughen up. Yesterday, some trucker tried to stiff her on the tip, and she just smiled and said, 'Have a nice day.' I would have followed him to his rig and given him a piece of my mind." The morning cook, Danny Sullivan, a burly man with forearms covered in kitchen burns and tattoos, had his own theories about Jessica. "She's probably some rich kid slumming it before daddy finds her a real job," he'd mutter while flipping pancakes. "Girl's got soft hands and perfect posture. That's not working-class stock." Even Tom Murphy, the diner's 72-year-old owner whose father had founded the establishment, saw Jessica as temporary help. "She's a good worker," he'd tell his wife over dinner, "but she won't last. This isn't her world. You can tell by the way she carries herself. She's educated, probably got bigger plans than serving coffee and eggs." What none of them knew was that Jessica's quiet demeanor and conflict-avoidant behavior weren't signs of weakness. They were carefully cultivated survival mechanisms, developed during 8 years of active duty service in the U.S. Army, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan as a military police officer with specialized training in urban warfare and threat neutralization. Jessica's journey to Murphy's Diner had been anything but typical. After graduating from a small college in Ohio with a degree in criminal justice, she'd enlisted in the Army with dreams of making a difference in the world. Her military police training had been intensive and comprehensive, covering everything from basic law enforcement procedures to advanced combat tactics. She'd excelled in every aspect of her training, particularly in close-quarters combat and tactical response scenarios. Her first deployment to Afghanistan had been a stark introduction to the realities of military service. As part of a military police unit responsible for convoy security and base protection, Jessica had faced threats that most civilians couldn't imagine: IED attacks, sniper fire, and armed insurgents who viewed American soldiers as legitimate targets regardless of gender or rank. She'd learned to read danger in a person's posture, to assess threats in seconds, and to respond with decisive action when violence was unavoidable. During her second deployment, Jessica had been part of a specialized unit that conducted joint operations with infantry units, providing security for forward operating bases and coordinating with local Afghan police forces. It was dangerous work that required constant vigilance and the ability to switch from diplomatic engagement to lethal force in an instant. Jessica had proven herself repeatedly in situations that would have broken weaker soldiers, earning commendations for valor and the respect of male colleagues who'd initially doubted her capabilities. Her third and final deployment had been the most challenging. Serving as a team leader in a military police unit responsible for training Afghan police forces, Jessica had been involved in numerous firefights and had saved the lives of fellow soldiers on multiple occasions. She'd received the Bronze Star for her actions during a complex ambush that had left 3 American soldiers wounded and their convoy pinned down by enemy fire. Jessica's tactical thinking and decisive leadership had been instrumental in extracting the wounded and neutralizing the threat. But military service had taken its toll. After 8 years of constant stress, hypervigilance, and the weight of life-and-death decisions, Jessica had made the difficult choice to leave the Army and return to civilian life. Like many veterans, she'd struggled with the transition from a world where her skills and experience were valued to one where her military background was often viewed with suspicion or simply ignored. The decision to work at Murphy's Diner hadn't been born of ambition or career planning. It had been pure necessity. Jessica's GI Bill benefits were covering her graduate degree in social work, but she needed income to pay rent, buy groceries, and maintain the modest apartment she'd rented on the outskirts of Millbrook. The diner job was supposed to be temporary, a way to stay financially afloat while she completed her education and figured out her next career move. What she hadn't anticipated was how difficult it would be to suppress the hypervigilance and tactical awareness that had kept her alive in Afghanistan. Every time the diner's door chimed with a new customer, Jessica's eyes would automatically scan for potential threats. She noticed exits, assessed the defensive potential of furniture placement, and unconsciously positioned herself where she could respond quickly to any developing situation. But in the peaceful environment of Murphy's Diner, these survival instincts made her appear nervous and skittish to her coworkers. "Girl jumps every time someone drops a plate," Rita had observed to Danny one morning. "Either she's got some serious anxiety issues or she's hiding something." Jessica had learned to modulate her responses to appear more normal by civilian standards, but the constant effort of suppressing her training was exhausting. She'd developed strategies for managing her hypervigilance, focusing on routine tasks, practicing breathing exercises during busy periods, and maintaining the quiet, unassuming persona that kept her coworkers from asking too many questions about her background. Her apartment reflected the same careful anonymity she maintained at work. The small one-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished with second-hand furniture and minimal decorations. Visitors, though she rarely had any, would see nothing that indicated her military service. Her awards and commendations were stored in a cardboard box in her closet, along with photographs from her. The only hint of her background was her morning routine, which she maintained with military precision despite having no official schedule to follow. Jessica woke at 0530 hours, completed a 40-minute workout that combined cardiovascular conditioning with strength training, showered, dressed, and arrived at Murphy's Diner exactly 15 minutes before her shift began. This routine provided structure and stability in a civilian world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Her coworkers attributed her punctuality and work ethic to good upbringing, never suspecting that her ability to memorize complex orders, her situational awareness, and her calm demeanor under pressure were the products of military training that had prepared her for combat operations in one of the world's most dangerous regions. The irony wasn't lost on Jessica that the same qualities that had made her an exceptional soldier, tactical thinking, threat assessment, decisive action under pressure, were perceived as weaknesses in the civilian world. In Afghanistan, her quiet confidence and measured responses had earned respect from hardened infantry soldiers. At Murphy's Diner, they made her seem timid and unsuited for the challenges of restaurant work. But Jessica had learned patience during her military service. She understood that perception and reality were often different things, and that revealing her true capabilities might create more problems than it solved. Her fellow servers didn't need to know that she could disarm an attacker in seconds, or that she'd led soldiers through some of the most dangerous terrain in Afghanistan. They needed to see her as harmless, unthreatening, someone who wouldn't disrupt the comfortable dynamics they'd established. As Jessica completed her opening duties on what would become the most significant day of her civilian life, she had no way of knowing that her carefully maintained cover was about to be shattered. In less than 4 hours, the survival skills she'd worked so hard to suppress would be called upon in a situation that would test everything she'd learned about threat response and tactical decision-making. The morning rush was beginning, with the familiar parade of truckers, construction workers, and office employees seeking their daily caffeine fix and hearty breakfast. Jessica moved efficiently between tables, taking orders with her characteristic quiet professionalism, unaware that she was being watched by someone whose intentions had nothing to do with coffee and eggs. Hidden behind her unassuming exterior was a warrior who'd proven herself in the crucible of combat. Soon, the peaceful atmosphere of Murphy's Diner would be shattered by violence, and Jessica Morgan would be forced to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed civilian identity and protecting the innocent people around her. The test was coming, and everything would change in 20 seconds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Tuesday morning that would change everything started like any other at Murphy's Diner. Jessica arrived at exactly 5:45 a.m., 15 minutes before her shift, and began her methodical preparation routine. She checked that the coffee machines were functioning properly, ensured the syrup dispensers were filled, and verified that the cash register contained adequate change for the morning rush. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, a legacy of military training that emphasized thorough preparation as the foundation of operational success. What Jessica didn't notice, but what her subconscious had already cataloged, was the unfamiliar sedan that had been parked across the street for the past 3 mornings, its occupant seemingly reading a newspaper while occasionally glancing toward the diner's entrance. Her combat-honed instincts had registered the anomaly, but her conscious mind had suppressed the warning signals in favor of maintaining her civilian facade. The morning rush began with its typical chaos. Truckers ordered their usual combinations of eggs, bacon, and black coffee while checking their phones for route updates. Construction workers grabbed quick breakfast sandwiches before heading to job sites. Office workers picked up elaborate coffee drinks that would fuel them through morning meetings. Jessica moved through the familiar choreography of taking orders, delivering food, and managing the controlled chaos that defined restaurant work during peak hours. But today felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension that Jessica couldn't quite identify, a subtle wrongness that made her hypervigilant systems activate despite her efforts to remain calm. She found herself unconsciously positioning herself near the kitchen door, maintaining visual contact with the entrance, and noting the locations of potential weapons or defensive positions. These were behaviors she'd worked hard to suppress, but stress had a way of bringing military instincts to the surface. "You seem jumpy today," Rita Martinez observed during a brief lull between customers. The veteran waitress had been studying Jessica's movements with growing concern. "Everything okay, honey?" Jessica forced a smile and adjusted her ponytail, a nervous habit she'd developed to give her hands something to do when adrenaline started coursing through her system. "Just tired, I guess. Didn't sleep well last night." But Rita's sharp eyes caught details that others missed. She noticed how Jessica's gaze kept drifting to the windows, how she positioned herself to maintain sightlines to multiple exits, and how her posture had subtly shifted from relaxed to alert. These weren't the behaviors of someone who was simply tired. They were the actions of someone who sensed danger. The tension in the diner increased when Marcus Crawford walked through the front door at 9:23 a.m. A regular customer who worked construction for Peterson Building Company, Marcus was normally jovial and talkative, known for his bad jokes and generous tips. But today he seemed agitated, his movements sharp and his eyes constantly scanning the restaurant as if looking for something or someone. Jessica felt her threat assessment protocols engage automatically as she approached Marcus's usual booth near the back of the diner. His body language was wrong, shoulders tense, hands clenched, breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a fine tremor in his hands that suggested either extreme stress or substance use. Most concerning was the way he kept checking his phone and glancing toward the entrance, as if expecting someone to arrive. "Morning, Marcus," Jessica said, keeping her voice calm and professional while positioning herself at an angle that would allow quick movement in any direction. "Coffee to start?" "Yeah, sure, whatever," Marcus replied without making eye contact. His usual friendly demeanor had been replaced by nervous energy that made Jessica's combat instincts scream warnings. "And maybe some eggs. Scrambled." "I don't know, just bring me something." As Jessica walked toward the coffee station, she noticed that Marcus was texting furiously on his phone, his fingers moving with urgent intensity. She also observed that he'd chosen a seat that gave him clear sightlines to both the front entrance and the rear exit, tactical positioning that was either coincidental or indicative of someone expecting trouble. Her military training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every survival mechanism she'd developed during 3 combat deployments was telling her that Marcus Crawford represented a threat. But civilian Jessica had learned to doubt these same instincts, to dismiss them as paranoia or hypervigilance left over from her military service. The internal conflict between her training and her desire to appear normal created a cognitive dissonance that left her feeling increasingly unsettled. The situation escalated when a second unfamiliar customer entered the diner at 9:31 a.m. The man was tall and lean, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a heavy jacket despite the warm October weather. Jessica's tactical awareness immediately flagged multiple warning signs: concealed identity, clothing inappropriate for the weather conditions, and movement patterns that suggested he was scanning for security cameras and potential witnesses. What made Jessica's blood run cold was the brief moment of eye contact between the new arrival and Marcus Crawford, a subtle nod of recognition that confirmed her worst suspicions. These men knew each other, and their presence in Murphy's diner wasn't coincidental. Danny Sullivan, busy with breakfast prep in the kitchen, noticed Jessica's sudden change in demeanor when she returned to place Marcus's order. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he commented, wiping grease from his hands on his apron. "What's wrong?" Jessica struggled to find words that would convey her concerns without sounding paranoid or delusional. How could she explain that her military training was screaming warnings about the tactical positioning and suspicious behavior of 2 customers? How could she articulate the subtle signs of threat assessment that had kept her alive in Afghanistan but seemed irrelevant in rural Pennsylvania? "I think we might have a problem," she said quietly, glancing toward the dining room where the second man had taken a seat with clear sightlines to the kitchen and cash register. "Those 2 customers. Something's not right about them." Danny followed her gaze, studying the 2 men with the casual interest of someone who'd been serving restaurant customers for over a decade. To his experienced but untrained eye, they looked like typical working-class customers, perhaps a bit more reserved than usual, but nothing that raised alarm bells. "They look normal to me," Danny said with a shrug. "Maybe they're just having a rough morning. You know how construction workers can be. Tough job, early hours, probably running on coffee and stress." But Jessica's assessment wasn't based on casual observation. It was the product of years of training in threat recognition and tactical awareness. She'd learned to read micro-expressions, body language, and environmental cues that indicated imminent violence. The way the second man kept his hands concealed, his constant surveillance of the restaurant's interior, and his positioning relative to exits and potential cover all suggested someone preparing for hostile action. The breaking point came when Jessica noticed the first man, Marcus, receiving a text message that caused him to suddenly straighten in his seat and look directly at his companion. The exchange that followed was brief but unmistakable, a subtle hand signal that Jessica recognized from her military experience as a go command, used to initiate coordinated operations. Every alarm bell in Jessica's head was now screaming, but she found herself trapped between her military instincts and civilian expectations. Her training told her to immediately alert authorities and prepare for violent confrontation. Her desire to maintain her carefully constructed normal life urged her to dismiss her concerns as paranoia and continue serving coffee as if nothing was wrong. The internal conflict was resolved when she noticed the second man adjusting something beneath his jacket, a movement she recognized as someone checking the position of a concealed weapon. The gesture was subtle, lasting less than 2 seconds, but it was unmistakable to someone with her background and training. Jessica made a decision that would either save lives or destroy her carefully maintained civilian identity. She walked calmly to the kitchen, where Danny was flipping pancakes and humming along to the radio. "Danny," she said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an urgency that made him look up immediately, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. In about 30 seconds, I want you to walk to the back office and call 911. Tell them there's about to be an armed robbery at Murphy's diner." Danny's spatula stopped mid-flip, his eyes widening as he processed what Jessica had just said. "What are you talking about? How could you possibly know?" "Please," Jessica interrupted, her military command presence bleeding through her civilian facade for the first time since starting work at the diner. "Just trust me and make the call. And whatever happens in the next few minutes, Stay in the back office until the police arrive." The transformation in Jessica's demeanor was subtle but profound. Her posture shifted from the relaxed stance of a waitress to the alert readiness of a soldier preparing for combat. Her voice carried an authority that Danny had never heard before, and her eyes held a hardness that spoke of experience with violence and its consequences. Before Danny could respond, the sound of chair legs scraping against linoleum echoed from the dining room. Jessica turned toward the sound, her tactical awareness now fully engaged, and saw both men rising from their seats with the coordinated precision of individuals executing a well-rehearsed plan. "Call now," she whispered to Danny, then walked back into the dining room where 8 innocent customers were about to become victims of a crime that would test every skill Jessica had learned during 8 years of military service. The next 20 seconds would determine whether her carefully hidden identity as a combat veteran would remain secret or explode into the open with consequences she couldn't predict. But as she watched the 2 men moving into position, Jessica realized that her choice had already been made the moment she'd sworn an oath to protect the innocent, whether in Afghanistan or Pennsylvania. The transformation from invisible waitress to tactical operator was about to begin, and Murphy's Diner would never be the same. At 9:47 a.m., Murphy's Diner contained 11 people whose lives were about to intersect in the most violent 20 seconds in the restaurant's 40-year history. Jessica had positioned herself behind the counter, ostensibly organizing coffee supplies while maintaining visual contact with both suspects. Her breathing had shifted to the controlled rhythm she'd learned in combat, deep, measured breaths that would keep her oxygenated and calm when violence erupted. The morning customers were oblivious to the danger developing around them. At the corner booth, retired teacher Margaret Fleming was reading her newspaper while sipping coffee that had grown cold 20 minutes earlier. 2 tables over, auto mechanic Steve Patterson was scrolling through his phone between bites of scrambled eggs, occasionally chuckling at social media posts. Near the window, young mother Sarah Chen was trying to convince her 4-year-old son Tommy to finish his pancakes before they left for daycare. These were the people Jessica had sworn to protect when she'd raised her right hand and taken the oath of enlistment 8 years earlier. That oath hadn't expired when she'd left active duty. It had simply expanded beyond military service to encompass any situation where innocent lives were threatened by those who would do them harm. Danny Sullivan had retreated to the back office as instructed, though Jessica could see the confusion and disbelief on his face as he'd walked away. She'd heard him pick up the phone, but whether he'd actually called 911 or was trying to contact Tom Murphy to discuss his paranoid waitress remained unknown. Either way, Jessica knew that help, if it came at all, would arrive too late to prevent what was about to happen. The transformation began when Marcus Crawford received another text message. Jessica watched his body language shift from nervous anticipation to focused determination as he read whatever instructions had been sent to his phone. He glanced toward his accomplice, who responded with an almost imperceptible nod. Then both men began moving with the coordinated precision of individuals executing a well-rehearsed plan. Marcus stood first, his movement casual but purposeful as he walked toward the front of the restaurant. His accomplice remained seated, but shifted his position to provide overwatch of the dining room while maintaining clear sightlines to the kitchen and rear exit. The tactical coordination was sophisticated enough to suggest military or law enforcement training, which meant Jessica was dealing with professionals rather than opportunistic criminals. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying inevitability of a carefully orchestrated military operation. Marcus reached the counter where elderly cashier Helen Burke was counting morning receipts, her arthritis-gnarled fingers moving slowly through the stack of bills and credit card slips. He leaned forward with apparent casualness, as if placing an additional order, then spoke words that shattered the peaceful morning atmosphere forever. "Everyone listen up," Marcus announced, his voice carrying across the diner with commanding authority. "This is a robbery. Nobody moves, nobody talks, nobody gets hurt." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Margaret Fleming looked up from her newspaper with the startled expression of someone who couldn't quite process what she'd heard. Steve Patterson's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, scrambled eggs sliding back onto his plate as his brain struggled to reconcile the mundane setting with the extraordinary situation developing around him. Sarah Chen instinctively pulled her son closer, her maternal instincts overriding everything else as she sought to protect the most vulnerable person in the room. But it was what happened next that transformed a simple robbery into a life-threatening crisis. Helen Burke, 73 years old and suffering from declining hearing, either didn't understand what Marcus had said or chose to ignore it. She continued counting receipts, her attention focused on the mundane task of balancing the morning's transactions. "I said freeze!" Marcus shouted, his calm demeanor evaporating as his carefully planned operation encountered its first unexpected variable. "Stop what you're doing and step away from the register." Helen looked up with the confused expression of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what was being asked of her. Her response was the worst possible outcome from Marcus's perspective. She reached for the phone beside the cash register, either to call for help or to contact Tom Murphy about the strange customer who was shouting at her. That's when Marcus drew his weapon. The Glock 19 appeared in his hand with practiced smoothness, the black polymer frame and steel slide creating a stark contrast against the diner's cheerful yellow walls. The sight of the firearm transformed confusion into terror as every customer in Murphy's diner suddenly understood that their lives were in immediate danger. "Nobody move!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking under the stress of an operation that was already deviating from plan. "Everyone on the ground now!" Sarah Chen dropped to her knees beside the booth, pulling Tommy down with her while trying to shield him from the sight of the weapon. Margaret Fleming sat frozen in terror, her newspaper crinkling in hands that had begun to shake uncontrollably. Steve Patterson slowly raised his hands, his phone clattering to the table as he complied with the gunman's demands. But the situation deteriorated further when 4-year-old Tommy Chin, confused and frightened by his mother's sudden change in behavior, began to cry. The sound of the child's distress cut through the tension like a knife, adding an element of unpredictable chaos to an already volatile situation. "Shut that kid up!" Marcus yelled, swinging the Glock toward the booth where Sarah was desperately trying to comfort her son. "I said shut him up now!" It was at that precise moment, 9:47 and 37 seconds a.m., that Jessica Morgan made the decision that would reveal everything she'd worked so hard to hide. She'd spent months suppressing her military training, convincing herself that her hypervigilance was paranoia and her tactical awareness was unnecessary in civilian life. But watching a frightened mother try to protect her child while an armed criminal pointed a loaded weapon in their direction stripped away every pretense and revealed the warrior beneath. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. Jessica's posture shifted from the relaxed stance of a waitress to the alert readiness of a combat veteran. Her breathing became controlled and focused. Her field of vision expanded to encompass every person, every potential weapon, every possible avenue of approach and escape. Most importantly, her mind began processing tactical options with the cold calculation of someone trained to win firefights against professional soldiers. Marcus's accomplice, who'd remained seated throughout the initial confrontation, finally stood and revealed his own weapon, a snub-nosed .38 revolver that he held with the confident grip of someone familiar with firearms. The presence of two armed criminals fundamentally changed the tactical equation, transforming a single-threat scenario into a complex engagement that would require split-second timing and flawless execution. "You," Marcus pointed the Glock directly at Jessica, who'd remained behind the counter throughout the robbery attempt. "Get over here and open this register. You've got 10 seconds before I start shooting people." Jessica looked into Marcus's eyes and saw something that chilled her more than the presence of the weapons: desperation mixed with chemical influence. His pupils were dilated, his movements were too sharp and erratic, and there was a manic quality to his voice that suggested methamphetamine use. She was dealing with armed criminals who were under the influence of drugs that impaired judgment and increased the likelihood of violence. "Please," Sarah Chen whispered from her position on the floor, her arms wrapped protectively around Tommy. "Just take whatever you want, don't hurt my baby." The sound of the mother's plea triggered something deep in Jessica's psyche, a protective instinct that had been forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and tempered by years of training designed to prepare soldiers for exactly this type of scenario. She'd faced armed insurgents who were better trained, better equipped, and more experienced than the two criminals now threatening innocent civilians in Murphy's diner. Jessica began walking toward the cash register, her movements appearing compliant, but her mind calculating distances, angles, and timing. She was positioned approximately 8 feet from Marcus, 12 feet from his accomplice, and had clear sight lines to both weapons. More importantly, her position behind the counter provided partial concealment and access to potential improvised weapons. "That's right," Marcus said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed he was in complete control. "Just do what I say and nobody gets hurt." But Marcus Crawford had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed that the quiet waitress approaching the cash register was a helpless civilian who would comply with his demands out of fear and self-preservation. He had no way of knowing that Jessica Morgan had survived 3 combat deployments, earned expert marksman qualifications with multiple weapon systems, and possessed hand-to-hand combat skills that had been tested against some of the world's most dangerous opponents. As Jessica reached for the cash register, her fingers closed around something that would have been invisible to untrained eyes but felt like salvation to someone with her background, a heavy metal coffee pot that had been sitting on the warming plate behind the counter. The ceramic-lined stainless steel container weighed approximately 3 pounds when full and could serve as either an improvised weapon or a tactical distraction. "Hurry up," Marcus shouted, his patience evaporating as the stress of the operation continued to mount. "Open the damn register!" Jessica's finger hovered over the cash register's opening mechanism, but her tactical awareness was focused on the 2 armed men who represented imminent threats to the innocent people around her. She'd identified her primary target, Marcus, who was closer and appeared more unstable, her secondary target, the accomplice with the revolver, and her tactical objectives, neutralize both threats while minimizing risk to civilians. What happened next would take exactly 20 seconds and would transform Jessica Morgan from an invisible waitress into a local legend whose actions would be analyzed by law enforcement professionals and military instructors for years to come. The moment of truth had arrived, and 8 years of military training were about to collide with criminal desperation in the most explosive 20 seconds in Murphy's Diner's history. Second 1. Jessica's fingers closed around the metal coffee pot as Marcus Crawford stepped closer to the register, his Glock 19 now pointed directly at her center mass. His accomplice maintained overwatch from his position near the window, the .38 revolver trained on the terrified customers huddled on the floor. What neither criminal realized was that they'd just cornered the most dangerous person in Murphy's Diner, a combat veteran whose muscle memory had been forged in the mountains of Afghanistan and refined through countless hours of close-quarters combat training. Second 2. "I said open it," Marcus screamed, his voice cracking under the combined stress of drugs and desperation. The barrel of his weapon was now less than 4 feet from Jessica's chest, close enough that she could see his finger tightening on the trigger. But proximity was a double-edged sword. While it increased the lethality of his weapon, it also brought him within range of her hand-to-hand combat capabilities. Second 3. Jessica's tactical assessment was complete. Primary threat: Marcus, approximately 40 inches away, armed with a semi-automatic pistol, showing signs of chemical impairment that made him unpredictable and potentially trigger-happy. Secondary threat: accomplice, 12 feet away, armed with a revolver, maintaining overwatch but focused primarily on controlling the civilian hostages. Environmental factors: 8 innocent civilians, including a 4-year-old child. Confined space with limited cover, multiple exit routes, but all currently dominated by hostile fire. Second 4. The moment of commitment arrived when Marcus made a critical tactical error. Frustrated by Jessica's apparent hesitation, he moved even closer, extending the Glock toward her face in an attempt to intimidate her into compliance. The movement brought him within arm's reach, exactly where Jessica wanted him. In Afghanistan, she learned that the most dangerous distance from an armed opponent was the middle ground, where you were too far away to fight hand-to-hand but too close to use cover effectively. Marcus had just eliminated that middle ground. Second 5. Jessica exploded into motion with the controlled violence that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. Her left hand swept upward, deflecting Marcus's weapon arm away from center mass, while her right hand brought the 3-pound coffee pot around in a devastating arc that connected with his temple. The impact produced a sound like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, a wet, crushing noise that echoed through the diner and announced that the balance of power had just shifted dramatically. Second 6. Marcus staggered backward, blood streaming from a gash above his left ear, but his finger reflexively contracted on the Glock's trigger. The pistol discharged, sending a 9mm round into the ceiling above the cash register, where it shattered a fluorescent light fixture and sent sparks cascading down like deadly snow. The muzzle flash illuminated Jessica's face for a split second, revealing an expression of cold calculation that would have been more at home on a battlefield than in a small-town diner. Second 7. The accomplice's attention snapped toward the sudden violence erupting at the counter, his .38 revolver swinging away from the hostages and toward Jessica. But he was operating under the assumption that he was dealing with a panicked civilian who'd gotten lucky with a desperate attack. He had no way of knowing that Jessica had already identified him as her secondary target and was moving with the tactical precision of someone trained to engage multiple armed opponents simultaneously. Second 8. Jessica didn't pause to admire the damage she'd inflicted on Marcus. Instead, she used his momentary incapacitation to launch herself over the counter in a fluid motion that combined gymnastic grace with combat aggression. Her military training had emphasized the importance of maintaining momentum in close-quarters battle. Hesitation was death, and second-guessing was a luxury that combat veterans couldn't afford. Second 9. The accomplice fired his first shot just as Jessica's feet hit the dining room floor. The .38 slug gouged a chunk of wood from the counter, where she'd been standing a split second earlier, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. But he was aiming at where she had been, not where she was going. And Jessica was already moving toward him, with the predatory focus of someone who'd learned to hunt human beings in some of the world's most dangerous terrain. Second 10. Marcus, despite the head trauma from the coffee pot impact, managed to maintain his grip on the Glock and was attempting to reacquire Jessica as a target. Blood was obscuring his vision and his movements were unsteady, but a wounded opponent with a loaded firearm was still a lethal threat. Jessica's peripheral vision tracked his attempts to bring the weapon to bear while she closed distance with his accomplice, her mind processing multiple threats with the multitasking ability that separated elite soldiers from conventional troops. Second 11. The accomplice's second shot went wide as Jessica closed to within 6 feet of his position. He was discovering what Marcus had learned too late, that proximity to Jessica Morgan wasn't a tactical advantage for the person holding the gun. Her approach was textbook military doctrine: move fast, stay low, present the smallest possible target while closing to within range of her primary weapons, her hands, feet, and the 8 years of combatives training that had made her lethal in confined spaces. Second 12. Jessica's attack on the accomplice was a masterpiece of applied violence. Her left hand struck his gun arm with enough force to deflect the .38 toward the ceiling, while her right hand delivered a palm strike to his solar plexus that drove the air from his lungs and sent him stumbling backward into the booth where Margaret Fleming had been sitting. The elderly woman had rolled under the table at the first sound of gunfire, her survival instincts overriding her arthritis and confusion. Second 13. The .38 revolver discharged again, this time into the ceiling, as the accomplice's nervous system struggled to process the devastating body shot Jessica had delivered. But she wasn't finished with him. Combat doctrine emphasized the importance of neutralizing threats completely, rather than assuming that one strike would be sufficient. Her follow-up was a knee strike to his midsection that doubled him over and left him gasping for breath, while his weapon hand went limp. Second 14. Marcus had managed to clear his vision enough to reacquire Jessica as a target, but she was no longer where his drug-impaired reflexes expected her to be. Instead of standing over his accomplice, she had rolled to her right and taken cover behind the booth, where Steve Patterson was still lying flat on the floor, his hands covering his head in a futile attempt to shield himself from the gunfire erupting around him. Izalida. Second 15. The Glock discharged again, its 9mm round punching through the vinyl booth, cushioning exactly where Jessica had been a heartbeat earlier. Foam stuffing exploded from the impact point, creating a small snowstorm of synthetic material that drifted down onto Steve Patterson's trembling form. But Jessica had anticipated Marcus's shot and was already moving, using the booth for concealment while she planned her final approach. Second 16. Marcus's fourth shot shattered the window behind Jessica's position, sending tempered glass cascading onto the sidewalk outside Murphy's diner. The sound of breaking glass mixed with the screams of terrified customers and the harsh breathing of two men who were learning that they'd chosen the wrong target for their robbery attempt. The accomplice was still trying to regain control of his weapon, but his hands were shaking from shock and oxygen deprivation. Second 17. Jessica emerged from behind the booth like a force of nature, her approach angled to avoid presenting Marcus with a clear shot while positioning herself for maximum impact. Her timing was perfect. Marcus was cycling through his ammunition too quickly, his drug-impaired judgment causing him to waste shots on targets he couldn't clearly see. The tactical advantage was shifting decisively in her favor. Second 18 Marcus pulled the trigger again, but this time, the Glock's firing pin struck an empty chamber. In his panic and chemical confusion, he'd burned through his magazine without counting rounds or maintaining proper fire discipline. The distinctive click of an empty weapon echoed through the diner like a death knell, announcing that the primary threat had just become significantly less dangerous. Second 19. Jessica's final assault was a thing of terrible beauty. 8 years of military training compressed into a single moment of applied violence that would end the threat permanently. She covered the remaining distance to Marcus in 2 quick steps, her left hand controlling his gun arm, while her right delivered an uppercut to his jaw that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into the cash register, with enough force to activate the opening mechanism he'd been demanding she operate just seconds earlier. Second 20. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Marcus Crawford lay unconscious beside the now open cash register, blood pooling beneath his head from multiple impact points. His accomplice sat slumped in the booth, still conscious but completely incapacitated, his .38 revolver lying uselessly on the floor where it had fallen from nerveless fingers. Around the dining room, 8 civilians slowly raised their heads from various hiding positions, their eyes wide with shock as they tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Jessica stood in the center of Murphy's diner, her uniform disheveled and her ponytail askew, but otherwise appearing remarkably composed for someone who'd just single-handedly neutralized 2 armed criminals in the span of 20 seconds. Her breathing was controlled, her stance was alert, and her eyes continued to scan for additional threats even though the immediate danger had passed. The transformation was complete. The invisible waitress who'd served coffee and eggs with quiet efficiency had revealed herself to be something far more dangerous. A warrior whose skills had been forged in combat and refined through years of training designed to prepare soldiers for exactly this type of life-and-death encounter. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Danny's 911 call had finally been taken seriously. Jessica Morgan realized that her carefully constructed civilian identity was finished forever. But as she looked around at the 8 innocent people who were alive because of her actions, she understood that some secrets were worth revealing when lives hung in the balance. The 22nd war was over, and Jessica had won. The first police officer through Murphy's diner door was Sergeant Michael Torres, a 15-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department who'd responded to his share of armed robberies, domestic disputes. 2 men lay incapacitated in the dining room, one unconscious beside an open cash register, the other conscious but clearly in distress, slumped in a booth with what appeared to be significant abdominal trauma. Weapons were scattered across the floor, a Glock 19 with its slide locked back on an empty magazine, and a .38 revolver that had come to rest under a table. Broken glass from a shattered window glittered on the linoleum, and bullet holes in the ceiling told the story of a firefight that had lasted longer than most such encounters. But what truly captured Sergeant Torres's attention was the woman standing calmly in the center of the chaos, her waitress uniform slightly disheveled but her posture radiating the controlled alertness of someone prepared for additional threats. Jessica Morgan looked nothing like the typical victim of an armed robbery. There was no trembling, no tears, no signs of shock or trauma. Instead, she displayed the calm professionalism of someone who just completed a difficult but routine task. "Ma'am," Sergeant Torres said, his weapon drawn but lowered as he assessed the situation. "Are you injured?" "No, sir," Jessica replied, her voice steady and professional. "Both suspects are neutralized. The Glock is empty, but the revolver may still contain live rounds. No civilians were harmed." Torres paused, his experienced ear picking up something unusual in Jessica's response. Her language was precise, tactical, and completely unlike what he'd expect from a civilian who'd just survived a violent crime. She'd referred to the criminals as suspects rather than robbers, used the term neutralized instead of stopped, and provided a concise tactical assessment rather than an emotional reaction. "How many shots were fired?" Torres asked, his training taking over as he began documenting the scene. "7 total," Jessica responded without hesitation. 4 from the Glock, 3 from the revolver. All rounds went into the ceiling or walls, no civilian casualties. The precision of her account sent another signal to Torres's experienced instincts. Most civilians caught in a gunfight couldn't provide accurate round counts or detailed tactical assessments. They were usually too traumatized to remember specific details. But Jessica was recounting the incident with the clinical precision of someone trained in after-action reporting. More officers arrived within minutes, followed by paramedics who began assessing the two unconscious criminals. Detective Linda Hayes, the department's senior investigator, took charge of the scene and began interviewing witnesses. What she discovered during those first few minutes would fundamentally change how the Millbrook Police Department and the entire community viewed the quiet waitress who'd been serving coffee and eggs for the past 6 months. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Detective Hayes asked Jessica, her notepad ready to record what she expected would be a standard victim statement. Jessica's account was unlike anything Hayes had heard in 20 years of police work. Instead of the fragmented, emotional recollections typical of trauma victims, Jessica provided a clear, chronological narrative that included tactical assessments, threat evaluations, and precise descriptions of the suspects, movements, and weapons handling. "I noticed suspicious behavior from both individuals approximately 18 minutes before the robbery commenced," Jessica began, her military bearing becoming more apparent as she shifted into formal reporting mode. Subject 1 displayed signs of chemical impairment and maintained tactical positioning that suggested coordinated criminal activity. Subject 2 entered the establishment wearing clothing inappropriate for weather conditions and immediately established overwatch of the dining area. Detective Hayes looked up from her notepad, her pen frozen over the paper. No civilian witness had ever provided such detailed tactical analysis in her experience. Jessica was using terminology and observation techniques that suggested professional training in threat assessment and tactical operations. "Ma'am," Hayes said carefully, "what's your background? Have you had any law enforcement or military training?" It was the question Jessica had been dreading since the moment she'd revealed her capabilities. For 6 months, she'd successfully maintained her cover as an ordinary civilian, suppressing the skills and instincts that had defined her identity for 8 years. But there was no going back now. Her actions had exposed her true nature to anyone with the training to recognize what they were seeing. The revelation sent ripples through the growing crowd of law enforcement officers who'd responded to the scene. Suddenly, everything made sense. The tactical precision of her response, the clinical accuracy of her witness statement, and the controlled professionalism she displayed throughout the incident. They weren't dealing with a lucky civilian who'd gotten the better of 2 armed robbers. They were interviewing a combat veteran who'd applied her military training to protect innocent civilians. Danny Sullivan emerged from the back office where he'd been hiding since Jessica had warned him to call 911. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking as he looked around the diner that had been transformed into a crime scene. When his eyes found Jessica, his expression shifted from relief to something approaching awe. "You knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You knew this was going to happen. That's why you told me to call the police." Jessica nodded, understanding that her carefully constructed civilian identity was crumbling with each revelation. "I recognized the tactical indicators," she said quietly. "Their positioning, their behavior patterns, the coordination between them, it was consistent with pre-assault reconnaissance." Rita Martinez, who'd arrived for her shift just as the first police cars were pulling up, stood in the doorway with her mouth open, trying to reconcile the Jessica she thought she knew with the woman who'd just single-handedly defeated 2 armed criminals. The transformation was so complete that Rita wondered if she'd ever really known her quiet coworker at all. "Jesus, honey," Rita said, her voice filled with a mixture of admiration and confusion. "All this time, I thought you were just shy. I had no idea you were some kind of warrior." The word hung in the air between them, capturing something essential about Jessica that her civilian disguise had hidden for months. She wasn't just a veteran. She was someone who'd been forged in the crucible of combat and refined through years of training designed to prepare soldiers for exactly this type of life-and-death encounter. Detective Hayes continued her interview, but her questions had shifted from standard victim statements to detailed tactical debriefings. She wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how Jessica had managed to neutralize 2 armed suspects with such precision and efficiency. "Can you describe your engagement sequence?" Hayes asked, her notepad now filled with tactical terminology rather than the emotional reactions typical of robbery victims. Jessica's response was a masterclass in military precision. She described her initial threat assessment, Her tactical positioning behind the counter, her use of improvised weapons, and her systematic neutralization of both suspects. Her account included details about sightlines, fields of fire, and tactical movement that demonstrated years of professional training in close-quarters combat. But it was her explanation of the civilian protection protocols she'd employed that truly impressed the assembled law enforcement officers. Throughout the engagement, Jessica had maintained awareness of 8 innocent bystanders, positioning herself to draw fire away from the most vulnerable civilians while systematically eliminating the threats they faced. The primary tactical consideration was civilian safety, Jessica explained. Every movement, every engagement decision was calculated to minimize risk to non-combatants. Neutralizing the suspects was secondary to protecting the innocent people in the dining room. Captain Robert Chen of the Millbrook Police Department arrived as Jessica was concluding her statement. A former Marine who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before joining law enforcement, Chen immediately recognized the signs of a fellow warrior. Jessica's bearing, her tactical vocabulary, and her clinical approach to violence all marked her as someone who'd seen real combat. "Sergeant Morgan," Chen said, using her former military rank without being told, "I want to personally thank you for your actions today. Your training and courage saved lives." The use of her military rank in front of her civilian coworkers was like removing the final piece of her disguise. There was no pretending anymore that she was just a quiet waitress working her way through college. Everyone now understood that Jessica Morgan was a combat veteran whose skills had been tested in some of the world's most dangerous places. Tom Murphy arrived at the diner just as the paramedics were loading the 2 suspects into ambulances. The elderly restaurant owner had received Danny's frantic phone call and had rushed from his home to find his establishment transformed into a crime scene. When he saw Jessica standing amid the chaos, apparently unharmed and completely composed, his relief was palpable. "Jessica," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion, "Danny told me what happened. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mr. Murphy," Jessica replied, though she knew that nothing would ever be truly fine again. Her carefully constructed civilian life had been shattered along with the diner's front window, leaving her exposed in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. The media arrived within the hour, drawn by police scanner reports of an armed robbery that had been, quote, resolved by civilian intervention. Local news crews set up their cameras outside Murphy's diner, eager to interview the waitress who'd fought off 2 armed criminals with nothing but a coffee pot and her bare hands. But Jessica had disappeared by the time the reporters arrived, slipping away through the diner's back exit, while Detective Hayes was coordinating with federal authorities who wanted to review the case. She'd given her statement, provided her contact information, and then retreated to the privacy of her apartment to process what had just happened to her carefully ordered civilian life. As she sat in her sparse living room, still wearing her uniform from Murphy's diner, Jessica understood that everything had changed. Tomorrow she would be front-page news. Her military background would be investigated and publicized. Her quiet anonymity was gone forever, replaced by a notoriety that would follow her wherever she went. But as she thought about Sarah Chen clutching her 4-year-old son, about Margaret Fleming cowering under a table, about Steve Patterson lying helplessly on the floor while armed criminals threatened everyone in the diner, Jessica realized that she didn't regret her actions. Her oath to protect the innocent hadn't expired when she'd left active duty. It had simply waited for the right moment to be honored again. The secret was out, and there was no going back. Jessica Morgan, the invisible waitress, was gone forever. What remained was exactly what she'd always been beneath the civilian disguise. A warrior whose skills had been tested in combat and whose courage had saved innocent lives. The revelation was complete, and Jessica would have to learn to live with the consequences of being a hero. 24 hours after the incident at Murphy's diner, Jessica Morgan's quiet life had been obliterated by a media firestorm that transformed her from anonymous waitress to national sensation. The story had everything that modern news outlets craved: a humble hero, dramatic violence, and the compelling narrative of a military veteran using her combat skills to protect innocent civilians. The first news van had arrived at Jessica's apartment complex at 6:23 a.m., followed within an hour by teams from 3 local stations, 2 national networks, and a freelance journalist who'd driven from Philadelphia after hearing scanner traffic about the diner hero. By noon, Jessica's modest apartment building was surrounded by a circus of reporters, camera crews, and curious onlookers who'd been drawn by the commotion. Channel 7 News had been the first to break Jessica's military background, thanks to an unnamed source within the Millbrook Police Department who'd provided details about her service record. Their morning broadcast had featured dramatic footage of the diner's crime scene, interviews with shaken witnesses, and a detailed recounting of Jessica's 8 years in the Army that painted her as a real-life action hero. Years. Former military police sergeant Jessica Morgan, who served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, single-handedly defeated 2 armed robbers using nothing but a coffee pot and her bare hands. Announced anchor Jennifer Walsh, her voice carrying the breathless excitement that characterized local news coverage of unusual events. Sources tell Channel 7 that Morgan's military training enabled her to neutralize both suspects in less than 20 seconds, saving the lives of 8 innocent civilians. The coverage had quickly expanded beyond local news as the story was picked up by regional networks, then national outlets hungry for feel-good content that could balance their typical diet of political conflict and social unrest. By evening, Jessica's story was being discussed on cable news programs, dissected by military analysts, and shared millions of times across social media platforms. But Jessica wasn't available for interviews. She'd unplugged her phone, closed her curtains, and retreated into the kind of defensive isolation that had served her well during difficult periods of her military service. The attention was overwhelming and unwelcome, representing everything she'd tried to avoid by maintaining her low-profile civilian existence. The transformation of public perception was swift and dramatic. The quiet waitress who'd been invisible to most of Millbrook's residents was suddenly the town's most famous citizen, her actions being analyzed and celebrated by people who'd never heard of her before yesterday morning. The narrative that emerged from media coverage bore little resemblance to Jessica's own understanding of what had happened. She'd simply done what her training had prepared her to do, but the news reports made her sound like a superhero. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, a military psychologist interviewed by Channel 7, provided expert commentary that helped viewers understand the significance of Jessica's actions. What we saw at Murphy's Diner represents the highest level of tactical proficiency, Rodriguez explained to anchor Jennifer Walsh. Sergeant Morgan demonstrated situational awareness, threat assessment, and tactical execution that would be impressive in a military context, let alone civilian environment. Her ability to protect innocent civilians while neutralizing multiple armed threats speaks to years of specialized training and combat experience. The analysis elevated Jessica's actions from simple self-defense to professional-level tactical operations, reinforcing the narrative that something extraordinary had occurred in the small-town diner. But it also increased the pressure on Jessica to emerge from her self-imposed isolation and explain how a waitress had managed to defeat 2 armed criminals with such devastating efficiency. At Murphy's Diner, Tom Murphy was dealing with his own media siege. Reporters had transformed his quiet restaurant into a tourist attraction, with curious visitors arriving hourly to see the bullet holes in the ceiling and hear first-hand accounts from staff members who'd witnessed Jessica's transformation from mild-mannered server to lethal combatant. Rita Martinez found herself reluctantly cast in the role of Jessica's closest confidant, despite the fact that she'd barely known her quiet coworker before the incident. News crews interviewed her repeatedly, seeking insights into Jessica's personality and any signs that might have hinted at her hidden capabilities. She was always so polite, so professional, Rita told Channel 7's roving reporter, her discomfort with the attention evident in her nervous fidgeting. I mean, she kept to herself mostly, but she was good at her job. Real good. I just never imagined. I mean, who could have imagined something like this? Danny Sullivan had become the primary witness to Jessica's prescient warning about the impending robbery, a detail that added another layer of intrigue to the story. His account of Jessica's calm instruction to call 911 before the robbery began suggested tactical awareness that bordered on precognition. She knew, Danny told reporter. Detective Linda Hayes, speaking at a press conference outside the Millbrook Police Department, provided official confirmation of the tactical sophistication Jessica had displayed. The level of precision and restraint shown by Ms. Morgan is remarkable, Hayes told assembled reporters. She neutralized 2 dangerous armed suspects while ensuring that no innocent civilians were harmed. Her actions undoubtedly saved lives. The detective's endorsement carried significant weight, with media outlets eager to verify their dramatic coverage of the incident. Hayes's professional assessment confirmed that Jessica's actions represented genuine heroism rather than lucky accident, lending credibility to the growing narrative of the warrior waitress who'd emerged from anonymity to save her community. Federal authorities had also taken interest in the case, not because of any wrongdoing on Jessica's part, but because of the tactical implications of her background and actions. FBI analysts were studying the incident as a case study in civilian application of military training, particularly interested in how Jessica's combat experience had translated to a domestic law enforcement scenario. Special Agent Catherine Brooks, the FBI's liaison to local law enforcement, had reviewed Jessica's service record and been impressed by what she'd found. 3 Bronze Star medals, 2 Army Commendation medals, and multiple citations for valor painted a picture of a soldier who distinguished herself in some of the most dangerous environments on Earth. Sergeant Morgan's service record indicates exceptional performance in high-stress combat situations, Agent Brooks explained to Detective Hayes during their coordination meeting. Her actions at the diner are entirely consistent with someone who's received advanced tactical training and has practical experience applying those skills under lethal threat conditions. The FBI's interest added another dimension to media coverage, with national security experts weighing in on the broader implications of military veterans transitioning to civilian life while retaining their specialized capabilities. Jessica's story became a focal point for discussions about veteran employment, PTSD treatment, and the challenges faced by soldiers returning from combat deployments. But while experts debated the larger implications of her actions, Jessica remained sequestered in her apartment, struggling with the unwanted fame that had destroyed her carefully constructed anonymity. The attention was everything she'd tried to avoid by keeping her military background hidden, intrusive, overwhelming, and impossible to control. Her phone had rung constantly until she'd finally unplugged it, with reporters, book agents, and Hollywood producers all seeking to capitalize on her story. Multiple publishing companies had reached out through the Millbrook Police Department, offering substantial advances for her autobiography. A talent agency from Los Angeles had contacted Tom Murphy, hoping to arrange representation for The Diner Hero. Even a cable television network had expressed interest in developing a reality show around Jessica's life. The commercial interest in her story was as overwhelming as the news coverage, representing everything Jessica found distasteful about civilian celebrity culture. She'd joined the military to serve her country and protect the innocent, not to become entertainment for people who'd never faced the realities of combat or understood the weight of taking another human life. The psychological toll of sudden fame compounded the stress of the violent encounter itself. Jessica had dealt with plenty of life-and-death situations during her military service, but she'd never had to process those experiences while being scrutinized by national media and approached by strangers seeking autographs or selfies. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a veteran counselor at the local VA hospital, had called Jessica personally to offer support and counseling services. His message, left on her answering machine before she'd unplugged the phone, acknowledged the unique challenges she was facing. "Jessica, this is Dr. Thompson from the VA. I've been following your story, and I wanted you to know that what you're experiencing right now, the media attention, the public scrutiny, can be just as stressful as the incident itself. A lot of veterans struggle with unwanted attention after their service becomes public. Please call me if you need someone to talk to who understands what." As night fell on her second day of involuntary celebrity, Jessica sat in her darkened apartment, considering options that ranged from embracing her new fame to disappearing entirely by moving to another state and starting over with a completely new identity. Neither choice appealed to her, but the middle ground of returning to her quiet waitress existence seemed impossible now that her true nature had been exposed to the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more media attention, and additional pressure to emerge from hiding and explain how a seemingly ordinary woman had accomplished something extraordinary. But tonight, Jessica Morgan just wanted to be left alone to process what had happened and figure out how to reclaim some measure of control over her life. The hero had saved everyone except herself. 1 week after the incident at Murphy's Diner, the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had been fundamentally transformed by the revelation that one of their own had been hiding extraordinary capabilities beneath an ordinary exterior. The story of Jessica Morgan had resonated far beyond the initial news cycle, sparking conversations about hidden heroes, military veterans, and the assumptions people make about the strangers around them. The Millbrook Community Center had become an unlikely gathering place for residents seeking to process what they'd learned about their neighbor. Mayor Patricia Collins had organized a town hall meeting that was ostensibly about community safety and crime prevention, But everyone understood that the real purpose was to discuss how Jessica's actions had challenged their fundamental assumptions about the people living among them. "How many other veterans are there in our community?" asked Harold Barnes, a retired auto mechanic who'd lived in Millbrook for 43 years. "How many other people are we overlooking because we think we know who they are based on their job or how they look?" The question hung in the community center's humid air, challenging an audience of nearly 200 residents to reconsider their neighbors with fresh eyes. Jessica's story had become a mirror that reflected their own biases and assumptions back at them, forcing them to confront the possibility that they'd been blind to remarkable people hiding in plain sight. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a sociology professor from nearby Hartwell College, had been invited to facilitate the discussion. Her research focused on veteran integration and community recognition, making her uniquely qualified to help Millbrook residents understand the broader implications of what had occurred at their local diner. "What Jessica Morgan's story tells us," Dr. Warren explained to the assembled crowd, "is that our communities are full of people whose experiences and capabilities we never truly see. Veterans in particular often struggle with the transition from military service to civilian life, partly because their skills and experiences aren't recognized or valued in their new environment." The academic analysis provided a framework for understanding Jessica's experience, but it was the personal testimonies from other local veterans that truly illuminated the challenges of maintaining dual identities in small-town America. 3 other military veterans had attended the meeting, each sharing their own stories of concealing their backgrounds to fit into civilian communities. Frank Morrison, who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning to work at the local hardware store, described 45 years of hiding his combat experience from neighbors who saw him only as a friendly clerk who could help them find the right screws and bolts. "People don't want to know about the war," Morrison explained, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed memories. "They want you to be normal, to fit in, to not remind them of unpleasant things, so you learn to keep quiet about what you've seen and done." Sarah Williams, a Gulf War veteran who'd been working as a school nurse for 15 years, nodded in recognition at Morrison's words. "I've been treating kids, scraped knee." The testimonies revealed a pattern that extended far beyond Jessica's individual experience. Military veterans throughout Millbrook had been hiding their service records, suppressing their capabilities, and maintaining carefully constructed civilian identities that bore little resemblance to their true experiences and abilities. But Jessica's public revelation had created an unexpected opportunity for other veterans to emerge from the shadows. The positive community response to her heroic actions suggested that Millbrook was ready to acknowledge and celebrate the hidden strength that existed within their population. Captain Robert Chen, who'd attended the meeting in his capacity as liaison between the police department and veteran community, addressed the practical implications of what residents had learned. "What Jessica demonstrated," Chen explained, "is that our community has resources and capabilities that we've never recognized or utilized. There are people living among us who possess skills in crisis management, tactical assessment, and emergency response that could benefit everyone." The captain's observations sparked discussion about how Millbrook could better integrate veteran skills into community preparedness and emergency response. Several residents suggested creating a volunteer reserve program that would allow military veterans to contribute their expertise during natural disasters, medical emergencies, or security incidents. Tom Murphy, who'd been struggling with media attention and curious tourists at his diner, stood to address the assembly with obvious emotion. "I employed Jessica for 6 months," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "and I never really saw her. I saw a quiet girl who did her job well, but I never understood what I was looking at. She saved lives in my restaurant, but more than that, she's taught me that I need to see people differently." Murphy's confession resonated throughout the community center, where residents were grappling with their own failures of perception and recognition. Many had interacted with Jessica during her months at the diner, but none had seen past her carefully maintained civilian facade to recognize the warrior beneath. Margaret Fleming, the elderly customer who'd hidden under a table during a robbery, had become an unexpected advocate for veteran recognition and support. Despite her age and the trauma of the experience, she'd used her platform as a robbery survivor to call attention to the broader issues surrounding veteran integration. "That young woman saved my life," Fleming told the assembled crowd, her voice strong despite her 73 years. "But what troubles me is that she felt she had to hide who she really was to fit in here. We failed her long before those criminals walked into Murphy's diner, and we need to do better." Fleming's words carried particular weight because she represented the traditional values and generational perspectives that often struggled to accommodate the complexities of modern veteran experiences. Her call for community change suggested that Jessica's actions had created a rare opportunity for genuine transformation. The meeting's most surprising development came when Danny Sullivan, the cook who'd witnessed Jessica's prescient warning about the robbery, announced that he'd decided to enlist in the Army National Guard. Jessica's example had inspired him to seek his own path to service, and he'd already begun the enlistment process with a local recruiter. Seeing what Jessica did, understanding what she's been through, it made me realize that I want to be part of something bigger than myself, Danny explained to the crowd. I've spent my whole life in this town, working in kitchens, never really challenging myself. Jessica showed me what's possible when you're willing to serve others. Danny's announcement drew spontaneous applause from the assembly, but the most significant development occurred when Rita Martinez stood to make an announcement that surprised everyone present, including herself. "I've been thinking about what happened, about how I misjudged Jessica, about how we all did," Rita said, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "I want to start a program here in Millbrook to help military veterans transition to civilian life, not just job placement, but real community integration. A way for people to share their experiences and be recognized for what they've done." Rita's proposal represented exactly the kind of community transformation that Dr. Warren had described in her academic research. Jessica's actions had created awareness, and that awareness was generating concrete plans for positive change that would benefit future veterans settling in Millbrook. The logistics of Rita's veteran integration program quickly became the focus of practical planning discussions. The VFW post offered meeting space, local businesses committed to preferential hiring for veterans, and several community members volunteered to help with outreach and coordination. What had started as a response to one woman's hidden heroism was evolving into a comprehensive support network. Mayor Collins, recognizing the momentum that was building, announced that the city would formally partner with Rita's program and provide municipal support for veteran services. "What Jessica Morgan has shown us," Collins told the assembly, "is that we have strength in this community that we never recognized. It's time to change that." The formal municipal support transformed Rita's grassroots idea into an official city initiative, ensuring that Jessica's legacy would be institutional change rather than just individual recognition. The program would provide a framework for future military veterans to integrate into Millbrook without having to hide their service or suppress their capabilities. As the town hall meeting concluded, residents filed out into the Pennsylvania evening with a shared understanding that their community had been permanently changed by 20 seconds of violence and heroism at Murphy's Diner. They'd learned that assumptions were dangerous, that heroes came in unexpected packages, and that their neighbors possessed depths they'd never imagined. But Jessica herself remained conspicuously absent from the community transformation she'd inspired. While Millbrook residents planned veteran support programs and discussed the hidden heroes among them, the woman who'd started it all continued to avoid public appearances and media interviews. Dr. Warren approached Mayor Collins as the meeting ended, her expression thoughtful. "The community response has been remarkable," Warren observed. "But Jessica's continued isolation suggests she's struggling with the personal cost of her public heroism. Her actions saved lives and inspired positive change. But fame can be its own form of trauma, especially for someone who valued anonymity." The professor's insight highlighted the paradox at the heart of Jessica's situation. Her desire to help others had resulted in unwanted attention that threatened the very privacy and normalcy she'd sought in civilian life. The community's positive response was encouraging, but it didn't address Jessica's personal need to reclaim control over her own narrative and future. As Millbrook residents headed home with new perspectives on their neighbors and community, the question remained whether Jessica Morgan would emerge from her self-imposed isolation to embrace the positive changes she'd inspired, or whether the cost of heroism would prove too high for even the strongest warrior to bear. The community had been transformed, but the hero's journey was far from over. 2 months after the incident at Murphy's Diner, Jessica Morgan sat in Dr. Marcus Thompson's office at the VA hospital, finally ready to confront the psychological aftermath of her unwanted transformation from anonymous waitress to public hero. The modest counseling room, with its standard-issue furniture and motivational posters, provided a sanctuary where she could speak freely without fear of media scrutiny or public judgment. "The hardest part," Jessica explained to Dr. Thompson, "isn't what happened during the robbery. I was trained for that kind of situation. The hardest part is everything that came after. The attention, the assumptions people make about who I am, the way my privacy just disappeared overnight." Dr. Thompson, himself a Vietnam veteran who'd transitioned to psychology after his military service, "You saved 8 people's lives," Dr. Thompson observed, "but in doing so, you lost something important to you, your anonymity, your ability to control how people see you. That's a real loss, and it's natural to grieve it." The validation meant more to Jessica than the countless news articles praising her heroism or the social media posts celebrating her actions. Dr. Thompson understood that heroism came with costs that weren't always visible to the people celebrating from a distance. Over the past 8 weeks, Jessica had gradually begun to venture out of her apartment, though she'd avoided Murphy's Diner and the other places in Millbrook where she was likely to be recognized. She'd completed her social work degree through online courses, determined not to let the media circus derail her educational goals, and had begun considering her options for the future. The veteran integration program that Rita Martinez had proposed was now fully operational, meeting every Thursday evening at the VFW post and serving 12 local veterans who'd previously kept their military backgrounds hidden. Jessica had been invited to participate or even lead the program, but she'd declined, preferring to support the initiative from a distance while maintaining her personal privacy. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," Jessica told Dr. Thompson during their weekly session. "The media attention is finally dying down, and I have job offers from law enforcement agencies, private security companies, even a consulting firm that specializes in crisis management training." The professional opportunities had materialized as word of her tactical skills spread through networks of military and law enforcement professionals. Jessica's 22nd engagement with 2 armed criminals had become a case study in several police academies, and her name was known throughout the regional security community. But the offers that intrigued Jessica most weren't the high-profile positions that would capitalize on her newfound fame. Instead, she was drawn to opportunities that would allow her to help other veterans navigate the challenges she'd experienced. Positions in veteran services, counseling programs, and community outreach initiatives. "What appeals to you about working with other veterans?" Dr. Thompson asked, recognizing the therapeutic value that such work might provide for Jessica's own healing process. "Because I understand what it's like to feel like you don't fit anywhere," Jessica replied. "Military training prepares you for combat, but it doesn't prepare you for hiding who you are to make other people comfortable. Maybe I can help other veterans avoid some of the isolation I experienced." The insight represented significant psychological progress for Jessica, who was beginning to see her experience as something that could benefit others rather than simply a personal trauma to be endured. Her journey from isolation to potential service marked a crucial step in her recovery from the upheaval that fame had brought to her life. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on Dr. Thompson's office door. His receptionist, Maria Santos, entered with an apologetic expression and a message that she clearly considered urgent. "Dr. Thompson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a young mother here with her little boy who's asking to speak with Ms. Morgan. She says her name is Sarah Chen, and that Ms. Morgan saved her son's life." Jessica's breath caught as she recognized the names. Sarah and Tommy Chen were the mother and child who'd been in Murphy's Diner during the robbery. The 4-year-old whose crying had escalated the tension, and the mother whose protective instincts had reminded Jessica why her oath to protect the innocent remained sacred. "Would you like to see them?" Dr. Thompson asked gently, understanding that the encounter might be emotionally challenging but potentially therapeutic for Jessica's healing process. Jessica nodded, her heart racing as she prepared to face 2 of the people whose lives she'd saved 2 months earlier. She'd avoided contact with the robbery victims, partly to maintain her privacy but also because she wasn't sure how to process their gratitude or what it might mean for her future. Sarah Chen entered the office carrying her son Tommy, who was now 5 years old and had grown noticeably in the 2 months since the incident. The young mother's face showed obvious nervousness, but her determination to deliver her message was equally clear. "Ms. Morgan," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion, "I hope you don't mind us coming here. I've been wanting to thank you properly, but I knew you needed space after everything that happened." Jessica stood awkwardly, unsure of the appropriate response to gratitude that felt overwhelming in its sincerity. She'd saved lives because her training and oath demanded it, not because she'd sought recognition or thanks from the people she'd protected. Tommy Chen, who'd been shy and quiet during the robbery, had apparently processed the experience with the resilience typical of young children. He looked at Jessica with curious eyes that showed no trace of trauma from the violence he'd witnessed. "Mommy says you're a hero," Tommy announced with the matter-of-fact directness that only children possess. "She says you kept the bad men from hurting us." The simple statement from the child she'd protected cut through all of Jessica's psychological defenses and connected directly with the part of her identity that had driven her to military service in the first place. She joined the army to protect people exactly like Tommy Chen, innocent children who deserved to live without fear of violence. "I just did what I was trained to do," Jessica replied, kneeling to Tommy's eye level. "Your mommy did a good job protecting you too. She kept you safe during a scary time." Sarah Chen's eyes filled with tears as she watched the interaction between her son and the woman who'd risked her own safety to protect them. "I wanted you to know," Sarah said, "that what you did that day gave Tommy a chance to grow up. He starts kindergarten next month, and he's excited about learning to read and making new friends. None of that would have been possible without your courage." The specific, tangible impact of her actions hit Jessica with unexpected force. She'd understood intellectually that she'd saved lives, but hearing about Tommy's upcoming kindergarten enrollment made the abstract concept of lives saved concrete and personal in a way that transformed her understanding of what she'd accomplished. "There's something else," Sarah continued, reaching into her purse to retrieve a small envelope. "Tommy drew you a picture. He wanted to give it to you himself." Tommy proudly handed Jessica a crayon drawing that depicted a stick figure in a green uniform standing between smaller figures and two dark shapes that presumably represented the robbers. At the top of the page, in careful kindergarten printing, were the words, "Thank you, Jessica," in multiple colors. The drawing, with its innocent representation of heroism and protection, crystallized something fundamental for Jessica about the meaning of her actions and the purpose of her training. She'd spent weeks focusing on the negative consequences of her public exposure, but Tommy's artwork reminded her of the positive impact that justified every difficult moment she'd endured. "Can I keep this?" Jessica asked Tommy, who nodded enthusiastically. "Mommy helped me write your name," Tommy explained proudly. "I practiced a lot." After Sarah and Tommy left, Jessica sat quietly with Dr. Thompson, processing the emotional impact of the encounter. The drawing lay on the small table between them, its bright colors and simple message providing a powerful reminder of why she'd chosen a life of service in the first place. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Thompson asked gently. "Different," Jessica replied honestly. For 2 months, her first assignment would be developing a pilot program based on the Veteran Integration Initiative that Rita Martinez had started in Millbrook. Jessica's experience with hiding her military background, combined with her unwanted expertise in managing public attention, made her uniquely qualified to help other veterans balance their service identity with civilian expectations. On her final day in Millbrook, Jessica stopped by Murphy's Diner for the first time since the robbery. Tom Murphy greeted her with tears in his eyes and introduced her to the new security system he'd installed. Not because he expected more trouble, but because he wanted to honor the lesson Jessica had taught him about preparedness and vigilance. The diner's walls now featured a small plaque near the cash register, in recognition of Sergeant Jessica Morgan, whose courage and service remind us that heroes walk among us every day. The modest memorial was exactly the kind of tribute Jessica could accept: tasteful, unobtrusive, and focused on the values rather than the individual. Rita Martinez hugged Jessica goodbye and promised to keep her updated on the Veteran Integration Program's progress. "You started something important here," Rita said. "Even if you're leaving, what you began is going to help a lot of people." As Jessica drove away from Millbrook toward her new life in Harrisburg, she carried with her the knowledge that heroism wasn't about seeking recognition or accepting praise. It was about being prepared to act when action was needed, about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and about using whatever skills you possessed in service of something larger than yourself. The quiet waitress who'd served coffee and eggs for 6 months was gone forever, but what remained was something better: a counselor who would help other veterans find their own balance between service and civilian life, informed by the hard-earned wisdom that came from living through both triumph and its unexpected consequences. Jessica Morgan had learned that the price of heroism wasn't just the moment of action, it was everything that came after. But she'd also learned that some prices were worth paying, especially when the alternative was a world where children like Tommy Chen didn't get the chance to start kindergarten. The hero's journey was complete, and a new chapter of service was about to begin. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.